Hey guys, so my name is Natalie. I'm one of the co-founders of Tech for Social Good, and I'm really loving this turnout right now. I see a lot of familiar and unfamiliar faces around here, and that's really great to see. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land right now, and that we are currently gathering on their land, and that we should prepare to. So the reason why we're all here today is because we're gathering to hear the TED Talk presentations of our two lovely teams. So we firstly have the social media team, and we also have the facial recognition team right here. So I guess I just want to give you guys a bit of context as to what actually is the Interdisciplinary Research Program. You guys might not necessarily have heard of it, you just know that you're going to be listening to two talks right now from these two teams. But essentially, it's a program that Tech for Social Good started this semester. It's been running for the past 8 weeks, and we've gotten these two teams to research these two topics, social media and facial recognition technology, the past 8 weeks. And they've been helped by the lovely mentors sitting in the second row right there. I see Kimberly's browser's face. Yeah, I guess the reason why we started this program was because the essential mission of Tech for Social Good, us as a society, is basically to empower students, to inspire students to actually think about these technical issues on not just a very one-dimensional scale, but on a multi-dimensional scale, where heaps of people from multiple disciplines gather together and really just talk and share their ideas, which I personally felt as one of the co-founders that wasn't really existing in the University of Sydney. So I'm really glad that I started this with my fellow co-founders. And I think we've created a really great program, and I hope the participants think so as well. Yeah, so that's our mission. So in terms of the two teams here, we have social media led by Vanessa Lee, James, Katrina, Angie, and Sneha are in the team, so they'll be going first. Then we also have the facial recognition team. We have Aaron, who is the team leader. We have Rebecca and Anjika here today. And I really just want to say thank you to participants for really believing in us, believing in the Interdisciplinary Research Project. It's never been run before, but you guys believed in our mission and believed that this was something worth pursuing and doing in your like part-time extracurricular studies. So I just really want to thank you guys for doing that. And I also want to say a massive thank you to the mentors. They have been mentoring these teams every week for the past 8 weeks, giving them guidance, giving them extra notes, just giving them context of the world that's happening around them. So you guys have been the bloodline of IRP. So thank you so much for putting in so much effort. So in terms of the actual schedule today, it's going to be quite simple. We're going to have the presentations. They're going to be around 20 minutes long, and then afterwards, after each presentation, we're going to have a Q&A. The Q&A will be 5 to 10 minutes. Our mentors will be participating, and I hope some of the audience members will be participating too, if you find the presentations really interesting and you want to ask the members some questions. And then, so the social media team will be going first, then the facial recognition team. And then afterwards, I'll just be giving you guys a little spiel about Tech for Social Good a little bit more, if you guys want to become members. Yeah, so that's that. So I'll probably just let the social media team go first now. If you guys can give a big hand.
Hello, so thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Vanessa and I'm the team leader for the social media team. And as you can see, our research program has been exploring the social media have the power to create real social change. So from slacktivism to activism. So I'd just like to give a content warning. We are mentioning sexual assault today, so that's something that concerns you. Please feel free to leave or just let me know if there's any concerns. So have you or anyone close to you experienced sexual assault from someone who went to an all-boys school? So I don't know if you saw this poll in your Instagram story, but in February, this was the Instagram story poll that confronted me in the middle of my mindless newsfeed scrolling. It started a few days before in London by an ex-Australian private school girl, Chanel Contos, the story you might know. I must say, when I first saw the poll shared by one of my friends, I didn't really think much of it, but over the next few days, it snowballed with this this big debate over whether sexual consent education in high schools should be introduced earlier, and it led to kind of global change. So Chanel's story is uncommon, but part of a growing trend of successful campaigns started on social media. So how did social media facilitate the campaign? And more broadly, how can social media enhance or hinder activism and social movements? So that's what we'd like to explore today. So there are three key features of setting social media that set social media apart from traditional media. So the first, it's internet-based. Secondly, content is primarily user-generated. And thirdly, users set up personal profiles and can easily interact with other content and users. To better understand how social media can jumpstart social change, let's examine how Chanel's story evolved. Contos' Instagram poll started on February 18th when she voluntarily shared that she was sexually assaulted at age 13. When the poll quickly spread through her personal network on Instagram, garnering 1,500 views and an initial 205 yes responses, she realised that she had stumbled upon a deeply rooted issue within Australian high schools. The following day, the Sydney Morning Herald published a story on this poll, and it was soon reported on by major mainstream news outlets. Within a week of her petition, an overwhelming majority of Australian media were discussing what consent was, what rape is, and the alarming rate of sexual assault in schools. This public awareness led her to start a website to receive testimonies and a petition for earlier consent education. The speed and reach of sharing on social media benefited Chanel's cause, allowing her story to generate rapid awareness of the issue of consent as seen on this timeline. Within a month, she was liaising with school principals, the NSW police, and finally pushed for the implementation of laws surrounding earlier consent education. With 6,220 testimonies and 40,620 signatures for her petition for change, there is no doubt that social media activism has been embodied through her work. When we talk about social media and activism, stories like Chanel's dominate the narrative. Yet her story is an anomaly, a rare case of positive virality that allowed it to instigate positive real-world change. What often flies under the radar are the limitations of social media activism.
Social media algorithms are not designed for your good in mind. They don't care about what's healthy for you. They don't care about what's good for your family. And they don't care about the health of your nation's political discourse. What they are designed to do is to keep you engaged, to keep you scrolling down through the newsfeed. And what kind of content engages people the most? That's emotional and extreme content. Polarization is extremity in someone's political views. And social media algorithms, they unintentionally polarize us. How it works is you angry react to one extreme news story, and the social media algorithm sends you more. You read news from one source, and the algorithm sends you more from that source. And so over time, we become less exposed to views and content and information that critiques our own position. And what that happens is we are led into what's called an echo chamber. As we, as a society, fragment more into these echo chambers, we essentially have less common sources of information, bases of knowledge that we need to develop mutual understanding and mutual dialogue. Worse, we become less critical of news which supports our own positions. And so in this sort of situation, basic truths can become contested. And so misinformation thrives. And in this situation, it's harder to build a broad support for social movements. Social media algorithms also bring in algorithmic bias. What they do is they encode human biases, which leads to the privileging of certain voices over others, typically minority voices. In 2014, an African-American teen was shot dead in Ferguson, the US. And what happened was, while that gained traction in the local news media, it failed to trend on Facebook. What happened was the Facebook algorithm, it prioritized a different trend at the time, which was the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. And these algorithms, they are non-transparent. How they work is a closely guarded secret of social media companies. And they can change these without any accountability or oversight.
Another limitation of social media activism is known as activism. The UN defines activism as when people engage in when people do like simple measures to support a cause, but they're not truly engaged or devoted to make changes themselves. For instance, it could be liking a charity's Facebook page or doing a Ice Bucket Challenge. So when people are able to engage in social activism through social media, a bunch of people are able to join together to do the same action repeatedly and exponentially, but it also opens up for more pre-existing problems to take over, such as cultural imperialism. In 2014, Boko Haram kidnapped more than 270 girls in Nigeria. This story blew up in the Western social media with #KidnapOurGirls trending on Twitter. This was all done in disregard to the local Nigerian journalists and activists. For instance, this image that was used to promote the campaign, the girl in this image is not even Nigerian herself. So ultimately, in the end, awareness raised by social media backfired because Boko Haram, who used to be a small marginal terrorist group, were able to gain fame and also demand more ransom money for the girls. You can see that when people are able to do social movement through social media, the fast-moving world of social media, they're more susceptible to being ignorant of the context of the situation. And so with all of this distraction, the movement can become unstable instead and lead to no positive outcomes.
Now, as we saw in the Chanel contest campaign, what about social media's strength, that rapid awareness that it allows us to create? Well, that strength of awareness actually leads to social media's biggest weakness, that is creating movement frailty, greater vulnerability to oppression. In 2011, the Arab world erupted in a series of protests, protesting against oppression and authoritarian regimes. Now, these protests were heralded by the media as being fueled by social media. In just 6 days, hundreds of thousands of people were mobilized into Tahrir Square in Egypt. On the other hand, if we compare that to the 1963 March in Washington, which led to Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, that took 6 months for the same amount of people to be mobilized. And so if we were now to compare the results of these two different movements, the civil rights movement was ultimately successful in achieving its political objectives. However, the Arab Spring led to a series of civil wars, societal oppression and strife, and authoritarian repression, and that has been called now the Arab Winter. So why did the Arab Spring fail despite the greater mobilization allowed by social media? Well, consider this. In the 6 months that the civil rights movement was mobilizing for that march, and the 8 years of organizational organizing, which was before that, they were also building up leadership hierarchies, strong networks of trust between networks on the ground. They were building up organizational capabilities, and this allowed the movement to remain robust in the face of opposition. It also allowed them to coordinate and adapt to the new challenges and changes which occurred. And rapid mobilization, it simply doesn't produce these same structures which allow the movement to strategically adapt to the circumstances. And so we see that there's simply no time to build up these robust organizational capabilities. There's no clear leaders, and so the social movement is rendered more frail. And so social media's biggest strength in rapid awareness actually leads to its weakness, movement frailty. And in conclusion, we see that social media, it can bring us to awareness of a myriad of issues, but that can also lead to shallow button pressing without actually deeply engaging. We see that it can rapidly ignite these large mobilizations and movements, but also cause them to burn out easier in the face of opposition. And those algorithms which make social media so compelling and engrossing Those lead to polarization and bias.
So where do we go from here? It's clear social media can be a double-edged sword, and there is no clean-cut solution to better use these platforms for social change. However, by being aware of its limitations, we can use and take steps towards creating more social platforms. Users are the most powerful drivers of social media. We propose a focus on education for the younger generation in developing digital literacy and expanding their activism to more traditionally impactful avenues. Content trends occur because one individual and their network have enough social influence to band together a large community. Exposure is key. By making an effort to follow people outside of your digital bubble, you are actively combating echo chambers and educating yourself in the process. As Chanel says, the power of social media is that it draws on the small micro powers of the thousands, and that's how we got to a stage where change could happen. Then we have movement into the traditional sphere of action. While social media activism can often be short-lived, Chanel, as we saw, leveraged her media attention to begin creating real-world change. She also started a website as the primary location of her petition, which made her campaign more durable, allowing access to a larger group of people. The last main improvement that we suggest is the development of social skills in the virtual environment. This involves helping the younger generation to manage their online identity, digital distractions, and assist them in finding authenticity on these platforms. By more carefully engaging with social media, we can better use it to create and promote change. However, focusing exclusively on the users doesn't address the nature of social media, which facilitates issues of slacktivism, movement frailty, echo chambers, and misinformation. By also focusing on the legal levers and the ethical responsibilities of social media companies themselves, we can guide user social media habits to better produce change. In the words of Sydney University professor Kimberly Weatherall, we don't want to put all of the burden of being ideal on consumers. It's not realistic.
As pointed out by Professor Weatherall, there's a general principle that government shouldn't be interfering in what news organizations choose to say what is news or isn't news. In order to uphold the freedom of speech which each individual is entitled to, the government and legal framework should instead focus on controlling the platform function instead, because these functions are what is causing misinformation and manipulated information to be spread artificially. An example of what could be done is to improve the consumer protection and privacy law, such as finding dark patterns or limiting the use of micro-targeting advertising messages. In order to avoid a conflict of interest, an independent entity should be elected and funded by taxpayers. They will work on exposing the misconduct of social media companies and giving critical media education to the public. This team must be diverse, meaning that they're made up of experts not only in technology, but sociology, human rights, and so on. They must also be divided up to work closely in investigating individual major companies, as well as working with community leaders. In order to support the working of this body, social media companies must be legally obligated to provide the body with the inner working and detailed functions of their algorithm.
So what could social media look like? If we were able to design the platforms to suit the needs we have suggested, social media as we know it would inevitably be able to channel social change more effectively. This leads us to our last stakeholder, social media companies. From a technical standpoint, we can train fairer social media algorithms to reduce biases and amplify the voices of minorities. This includes avoiding predicting using historical data sets and adjusting the objectives of algorithms to prioritize a diversity of views rather than similar content. To mitigate further algorithmic bias, social media companies can also change structurally. Companies can improve the diversity of their teams who design social media algorithms and actively prioritize discussions and assessments of diversity of data and the creation of algorithms. Some social media companies already have taken some steps in this direction, such as Instagram, who have implemented an equity and inclusion team. From a design standpoint, social media companies can also add features to reduce extreme polarization and echo chambers seen in the current model of social media. They can add a level of diversification to the Discover pages and recommend less accurate media, which is dissimilar to past engaging content. thus reducing the echo chamber effects of social media algorithms. This can be extended with a scale of randomness or diversification, which can be adjusted by the user. This would allow the user to choose how tailored they want their feed, giving them the autonomy to see more diverse content. In addition, this sort of user-based design will draw attention to the personalization of your feed. Along these same lines, a share your feed feature, which allows you to interact with the feeds of another user, would also bring individuals out of their echo chambers and draw attention to feed customization. Finally, an example of a successful design feature, which has been used to tackle the problem of misinformation, is Instagram's flagging mechanism, which warns the users to be critical of information about issues such as COVID-19 or election information. This should continue to be implemented and extended in the future to reduce the severity of misinformation.
So as we've seen today, there is no silver bullet. The more autonomy given to the user, the more autonomy for them to control their feed completely and radicalize themselves. So the legal strategies we mentioned can help promote transparency and ethical usage of consumer data. However, they are limited in addressing misinformation and echo chambers due to the blurry nature of these issues. Technical solutions aren't always transparent and can't work without the group legal team as well. So as much as we like it, there is no perfect solution and no perfect social media platform. The potential solutions we presented today will require further research and work. Chanel's success is a unique case. She raised an awareness of an issue that already enjoyed public support as a Caucasian girl in a Western country. Minority campaigns in oppressive regions are less straightforward. But change is still possible, and the change we want to create can exist due to conceptuality and power. Social media thrives on the fact that the masses are putting information into the sphere for people to consume, instead of us just consuming hegemonic discourse, which is what creative culture is about. So on that note, we'd all like to leave you with a question. Has your social media improved your social awareness? Thank you. So any questions? Yes, Aaron?
Do you have any opinion on the recent conflict between the social media companies and the mainstream media? Trying to get them to pay for sharing their stuff from their source, and Facebook took down all the news sources for a period of time.
Sure, I can take it. That's actually an interesting case because that's sort of like the first time really we've seen in Australia, sort of like a showdown between the more traditional media and like these massive, big international tech companies. And I looked into this a little bit, and like from what it seems to me, the issue with that issue was more to do with sort of like the revenue model and sort of like how the traditional media were trying to essentially kind of like milk more money out of Facebook. Because like the sort of narrative was, oh, so they're getting this ad revenue from content that is going to Facebook, that they're just linking news articles back to these news platforms. But if you like actually look into the details, it's like the social media and the Google search engine, those are some of the biggest drivers of traffic actually to the news media sites. And so it's actually a net benefit to the traditional media. And if you like look even further into it, if you look like the deal that the government brokered with these social media companies, it's only the big media corporations which actually get access into like the inner workings of how the social media Google search engine is set up. And it actually is like the net effect, in my opinion, is that that law is actually going to further concentrate media ownership in Australia. Because the small guys, more independent news outlets, they don't get access to like that preferential deal with Facebook and Google. So I think like that issue's been like really politicized and there's been like certain narratives around it. But from my perspective, if you look into it, it's more of like a power grab from like Murdoch and tradition. Another question?
So about the solution for this, issues on social media. I feel like they make the assumption that a relatively equal amount of each demographic uses a platform. So what's your opinion on like more on platforms, social media platforms that are more site-wide echo chambers, for example, like Gab or Parler, which are effectively open and far-right safe spaces. So what are your opinions on those?
So, my opinion on those is that I was mentioning how laws just tackle the social media platforms function in amplifying this manipulative information. It should not be taken away with people's freedom of speech. So therefore, there must be laws against all of this like far extremist like websites or social media space for these people to voice their opinion instead of like banning the people itself from doing so. So do you want to add on to that? Cool. Did I answer your okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Anything else?
Would you say that pre-existing movements benefit much more from the rapid globalization of social media compared to new movements?
I would agree so. I think that like it works best in the context where there's already existing organization structures and sort of like ongoing on-the-ground networks. But really, it's entirely how we're going to function. So based off what we presented, if a movement were to exclusively or primarily rely on social media, we would predict it's much more friendly. But a new movement could always come up which does use social media, but also at the same time is building on those slower organizational capabilities and structures. And so social media can, I guess, benefit, but it just depends how it's used. Another question?
Some of your solutions that you were talking about were things like the personalization of the feed and making sure you get more diverse content. And that seems very much targeted at the kind of filter bubbles. Can you elaborate on the link between your concern about filter bubbles and people and polarization and the concern about activism and selectivism? Just wondering what the link there is.
So I think what we're trying to get at is the echo chambers actually help activism, because at the end of the day, and this is something Chanel said as well, she actively doesn't see misogynistic discourse in her social media channels because she has chosen not to see it. And that is where the personalization kind of comes in, why it can be effective, is that people are protected from these kind of extremist or, I guess, offensive, I can say, or controversial viewpoints that they don't see. And when it comes to the algorithm and like the personalization side of it, that's kind of the goal that we're heading with that, is that people don't have to feel targeted when they're sharing like informal stories such as that.
Just to add on to that, I think even with Chanel's case, we saw it was largely successful, but it was shared still within an echo chamber, within a bubble. So we have like young women talking to other young women about their experiences, which is great. But obviously, if we want more change to happen, we need to extend beyond that bubble. And that's why it's important that we have that diversification as well and removal of echo chambers for these movements to actually be successful.
Thank you.
First, I just want to say great presentation. And then I love like some of the insights about like the social media strategy that we use in the future. But I guess I'm struggling to kind of get convinced about how a big social media company would be motivated to actually implement those measures, especially since they would be driving some of the traffic away. They not, having these content that actually make the users click in and stay on the app long, which generates the revenue.
So what I would believe is that government really needs to get their act together and force those social media companies to follow the rules. Like it's harder to get a kettle approved for manufacturing than implementing a social media function. You kind of get where I'm going. So what happened was when they first implemented the like button into Facebook, they thought that it would help to spread love. But then years later, they found out that it actually negatively impacted the mental health of teenagers because for some people, they don't get enough likes, they feel excluded from society, and that drives them to suicide. So laws should be put into like make sure that functions that social media implement are actually benefiting or at least not causing extreme negative effects to the world. We also like acknowledge that these solutions aren't perfect in every way, and that the nature of these big tech companies is that they want money. And that's just the society that we live in. And that's kind of why we chose to start targeting the user base. And that's why it was like, as we said, like that's the forefront of our solutions, because it's our hope that by talking to all of you and that you will be able to kind of obtain some of those individual solutions that we suggested. And that is kind of where like the change starts, because we have to acknowledge that the society we live in is just, it is money-based at the moment.
Final thing to add on, I think we definitely realize that many social media companies got motivated to put these features in. The particular solutions that we discussed, I think, are ones which wouldn't take away too much attention or take people off the platform entirely. And so I think they are reasonable for a media company to pursue. Also, personal opinion for me, I would happily see more diverse media content on my feed. I find it tedious to see the same thing over and over again. So I think it's not like mutually exclusive. You can have more diverse content and that not take people off the platform. Any other questions?
Do you guys believe in the existence of like a good bias? Like if that exists, because there's kind of like two situations that you sort of mentioned or touched on. Like when people go on social media and they enjoy a safe space, could bias be technically good in that scenario? Or another scenario is, say for example, you're only interested really in the news surrounding your local area or your country as opposed to news outside. Do you think that that would be then an instance of good bias, or is it just always bad and it should be removed entirely?
We discussed this with our mentors about how we talk about removing bias in algorithms, and that's not really possible. By removing bias, all we're doing is just putting another bias in place. So I think it's really difficult to say if there's like one perfect, no bias solution. It's more about adjusting the bias, or at least being aware of it and assessing it and considering its effects on like the real world as well, to adjust it as needed.
Right, I think that's it. So I think we'll hear from the facial recognition team. So we'll move on to.
I all like know their stuff so well. Do the bias thing, like as a front and back page. So good. So. She's so so good. Yeah, and like most people don't like the type of stuff. Like most people are engaging as well.
Do you have? I might have to switch phones.
Yeah.
Hi, we are the facial recognition team and we're excited to present today. Thank you for joining us. Over the past 8 weeks, we've had the absolute privilege to explore the idea of facial recognition with the sort of Tech for Social Good team, as well as our incredible mentors, Professor Colombo Golson, Professor Kimberly Wetherill, and Dr. Roman Bashar. And we're so excited to present this newfound knowledge with you all today. Over the past few years, facial recognition technology has stepped into the limelight of the public debate. As an exciting and emerging technology, this is to be expected. But the potential societal impacts of FRT extend beyond the technology itself. With stakeholders at every corner of society, including governments, public and private institutions, human rights groups, industry insiders, and individuals,
The potential applications and ethical issues surrounding FRT fall into debates including racial justice, data collection, and digital privacy, and it impacts the role of artificial intelligence in our society directly. The debate is polarizing, with some citing the potential benefits of facial recognition technology in support of its use. Clearview AI, which has been in the public eye recently for their dealings with the Australian Federal Police and the use of social media images to form their data sets, argue that law enforcement should have the best tools available, and they believe that facial recognition technology forms part of this tool. Conversely, law and computer science academics at Northwestern University suggest that facial recognition technology is the most uniquely dangerous surveillance mechanism ever invented. Internet state. We believe that facial recognition technology has enormous potential for good, and this potential must not be ignored just because of these potential detriments. But what do we mean when we refer to facial recognition technology? FRT encompasses a broad range of tools with an even greater number of applications, but fundamentally, it tries to match a digital representation of a face to a physical image. Algorithms vary by company and application, but fundamentally, they draw the key features out of a face to create a digital blueprint, which then go on to identify an individual. This can happen in two key ways, and each comes with its unique set of risks and benefits. Facial verification refers to one-to-one verification of an image. So the computer system will map the image that it receives to one specific face. You see this when you use Face ID to open your iPhone. It knows what to expect and it identifies your face based on that data that's already been there. Facial identification, on the other hand, takes an image and attempts to match it to an entire data set. This is like when Facebook pulls the face out of your picture and then says, okay, your suggested tags. Due to the large variability in data sets and the have a go and see what it spits out attitude, the greatest risks are associated with this facial identification. And therefore that's what we'll be focusing most of this presentation on.
So one of the major concerns regarding this technology is its ability to be integrated into the already extensive surveillance infrastructure that already exists in a lot of developed societies. And then the potential for governments, intelligence agencies, and law enforcement to then abuse that technology to oppress their entire citizenry, part of the citizenry, or even people overseas. One of the most recent and compelling examples of this is in 2019 and 2020, when the Hong Kong pro-democracy riots were going on. So these riots were held in protest to a new law introduced by mainland China, in which citizens of Hong Kong could be extradited to mainland China to face charges and then be tried and convicted in mainland China. The New York Times had a really good article on this, detailing how the Hong Kong police were using their extensive surveillance networks within Hong Kong and facial recognition technology to try and identify some of the leaders of this movement. The police were seen having with their own cameras on poles. The riot police were seen using those to try and film the protests. And the protesters themselves had to resort to measures beyond just wearing masks. They used laser pointers to shoot at the CCTV cameras to mess with the system they were using, and more traditional things like spray painting and destroying cameras as well. It was a particularly harrowing example of one young leader who, after using his Face ID to open his phone, was instantly tackled by police, attempting to then access the data on the now unlocked phone, but fortunately the gentleman was able to lock it before got to it. It's also not just human rights groups and general citizens raising concerns about this technology. In 2018, Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, in a widely shared article that got some significant media attention at the time, raised his own concerns about the use of this technology and made his own call for public regulation in this space. He argued that one of the best ways to stop a government from abusing a technology is for that government to take an active role and responsible role in its regulation. He made this article in 2018, and in that article, he raised the potential for facial recognition systems to identify people attending political protests. And in less than 12 months' time, the Hong Kong Rights Movement became reality. He also had concerns about commercial uses in this space as well. He he painted a picture where using, say, eye tracking technology on your computer or cameras in traditional brick and mortar stores would observe the kind of products or websites that you commonly peruse and spend the most time on, and then use that to feed into your targeted advertising and similar to the filters on social media, create a world that's entirely your own and cut you off from other aspects. So another significant issue that's gained particular light recently is the racial bias within a lot of these facial recognition algorithms in terms of how they perform and how accurate they are on different genders and on different racial groups. Coded Bias is a recently released documentary on Netflix that paid particular attention to this issue. And one of the main characters in this documentary was a man named Joy Bolamwini. And she was, at the time, she was a PhD student at MIT. And she was developing a rather novel use of facial recognition technology in that it was a simple, basically a mirror with a camera attached to it. And when it saw that someone was in the mirror, it would give them a positive message to something. But she found that in her application of that recognizing her own face as a woman of color was very difficult. And until she put on a Phantom of the Opera style mask, she was unable to be detected by the technology that she was attempting to. So she was obviously a little concerned by this, but knowing that this technology was already being implemented to some degree in law enforcement in the US where she's based, and more extensively and internationally as well, she was concerned that if these biases or differences in performances, how it would affect, say, its application in law enforcement, and would it be fair for this technology to be used in law enforcement when these discrepancies, if these major discrepancies do exist. So this was the inspiration behind what became a thesis paper, which is entitled Gender Shades, Intersectional Phenotypic and Demographic Evaluation of Face Data Sets and Gender Classifying, or as she likes to shorten to, simply Gender Shades. So to do this, she measured the performance of 3 of the main facial recognition algorithms out there, that being Microsoft, Face++, and IBM. And she created her own data set to do this. She wanted a data set that reflected the broad range of skin colors and across society, and with a fairly equal distribution of men and women across the data set as well. To build this data set, she had quite an interesting approach. She looked at all the different nations around the world and determined which had the highest representation of women in their parliaments. She took the top 10 of those. She took 3 African countries and 3 European countries to get a broader spectrum of skin types. And she created a data set based on this. Now, initially, when you look at here, just the overall accuracy, everything looks to be fairly in order. Obviously, you want it to be as high as possible, but they all seem to be performing incredibly well. When she looked deeper and she broke it down initially by gender, you saw that it performed a lot better on male side represented female. And on the right here, she's broken it down, the subjects, in terms of their Fitzpatrick scales. The Fitzpatrick scale is a scale used by dermatologists to determine how in danger you are to sun damage and how lucky you are to get skin cancer. And so when she broke it down by skin types here, at the type 6 here, the chance that it would misgender one of the dark, a female of incredibly dark skin was about 50%. So essentially the accuracy was mouse to pattern. And then she grouped them slightly more generally, and the darker males, darker females, lighter females, lighter females. And as you can clearly see here, the greatest performance and accuracy was found in lighter males, and the poorest was found in darker females, with the error difference there, IBM being as high as 34.4%. Now, this obviously has alarming applications if you're going to use this technology as the basis to make an arrest. Now, the Georgetown Law Center on Privacy and Technology has a few interesting examples of how loose law enforcements, particularly in the US, are with this technology. And this is a very interesting case. So on the left was CCTV camera footage of someone who had robbed a convenience store in New York City. They put that facial image into their recognition software, and it created no matches. Then someone seemed to be under the impression that he looked a bit like Woody Harrelson, the actor here. So they put his face in, and it spit out someone who they thought it was, which obviously wasn't the person who thought it was, because it wasn't Woody Harrelson that spit out. That was used as a basis to make an arrest in this case. There are other examples of, because obviously CCTV isn't the highest quality footage in the world. This centre also highlighted examples where they'll search for someone on Google Images and find a face or a head shape that's very similar. And then they'll copy across the nose from their suspect and the eyes from their suspect and create an image that isn't anyone in existence. Put that in the facial recognition system and see what it spits out and see it. One of the most harsh or strong standpoints on this technology comes from a man named Luke Starr. He's an assistant professor at the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at the University of Western Ontario. He also has a research role at Microsoft. And in the Association of Computer Machinery, I think it was 2018 or 2019, he created this article, published this article, where he compared the dangers of this technology to that of weaponized plutonium, which is the material that was used in the bombs that dropped on Japan in World War II. So his argument was that, like plutonium, it represented such a danger to society that, and such minimal benefit, that its use here's a best word here. So facial recognition, simply by being designed and built, is intrinsically socially toxic. Regardless of the intentions of its makers, it needs controls so strict that it should be banned for almost all practical purposes. Another one of his arguments is the current applications being put forward for the use of these technologies largely amount to slightly increased convenience. So the Face ID on your phone is slightly more convenient to type in your password, for example. And the risks associated with this technology for such minimal gain, it isn't worth it, and it should be largely. However, this technology is still in its infancy, and we don't fully understand what the good applications or the beneficial applications of this technology are yet, because they haven't been developed yet. And as I was doing this research, I drew a parallel from a technology that I'd become familiar with a few years ago. This is public key cryptography. So up until the 1970s, the NSA essentially controlled encryption. they managed the keys that used it, and you had to go through them for the most part to send encoded messages between two parties. They also heavily controlled the information around this area of research as well. Then two researchers at Stanford created groundbreaking technology called public key cryptography. This was essentially, and still largely is today, an unbreakable way for two parties to send encoded messages with each other without the need for anyone else. Obviously, they got word of this, weren't too happy, and informed the two researchers that if they released this research, it would be considered the legal equivalent of providing nuclear arms to a foreign power. So they didn't release it. Their professor did. He stood at a conference, read their paper out loud while those two researchers stood in complete silence behind him. Now, initially, very few people could understand the potential of this technology. This technology forms the basis for all digital commerce. It provides the necessary security and trust that allows most digital commerce to take place today. You also use it every time you access a website with the words HTTP. So I think there's a lesson to be learned here. And we need to be very careful to judge a technology in its infancy in what we can only see it being used for now. Because there's some very exciting research being done, particularly in the healthcare space, where this could stand to benefit a lot of people in a very substantial way.
Okay. So in 2019, a Chinese citizen, her name was Huan Huan, she was at this very interesting situation where her rhinoplasty surgery was found to be too drastic by facial recognition systems in China to allow her to properly live as a citizen. She was unable to find work. She could not access public transport systems, and she was basically ejected out of the government database. And that took at least a month to be sorted out. She had to file for a new identity, a new facial identity. But hey, at least the surgery went well and she's happy with her. There's also this interesting connection that forensics have found between facial reconstruction and facial recognition. So facial recognition identifies the suspect, facial reconstruction identifies the victim. They're both connected in the sense that they both are trying to verify or find out the identity of the unknown. However, what's not been discussed or given adequate academic attention yet is how facial recognition stands to impact facial reconstructive surgery. Yet unpublished paper from the University of Kentucky identifies at least two ways in which FRT stands to benefit FRS. So I'm going to use the abbreviation because they're too long. The two ways in which it can benefit facial reconstructive surgery. The first one being that it could match donors or facial transplantation accurately, and the second one being that intelligent FRT could guide surgical planning and lead to better outcomes for patients. Now, this led me to research more about sort of identity politics, how it stands to benefit victims of trauma, people with congenital defects, and that sort of led me to research about these very interesting stories. I would tell you I would discuss the value of the face now by giving you this example of acid attack victims, particularly in South Asian countries. So the face is not just your biological barrier that protects your sense of taste, sight, smell. It's also it's also closely tied to your self-esteem, your concept of identity, and not just your own concept of your own identity, also the society's concept of your own identity. When stalkers and spurned lovers, and this has actually been more prevalent in terms of violence against women. When stalkers and spurned lovers choose to attack the faith, they're not just attacking the social and personal identity, they're trying to attack particularly the marital and economic identities of women. Trauma victims stand to benefit more prominently with advances in facial recognition technology. I'll explain how the current FRT works in image analysis. So we're not yet at the juncture where we're able to adequately use FRT in facial reconstructive surgery. But so far what we've done is we're able to use FRT to, we're able to improve FRT to understand facial structures of plastic surgery, of patients needing plastic surgery. The current technology works with two systems. So there's the GIST, which focuses on the global aspects of the face. It identifies the different shapes of facial features. And then there's a local binary pattern, which sort of gives information about textures in these different facial features. This is currently inadequate because if the algorithm is out of date and it can't accommodate and because it's not intelligent enough, it's not able to guide surgical planning. But that's being changed with neural networks and probabilistic models. Then there's also the aspect of this being completely two-dimensional. To allow efficient facial transplantation, there is a need to assess these images in 3 dimensions. And that's also being changed with holograms and smart face control. Then there's also racial bias, which has prevented, as Adam spoke about, as Adam previously talked about this. It's also prevented the accurate identification of facial features. But that's also set to change with better training and different models being used. The success of, or the probable success of FRT and the impact that it stands to have on facial or on healthcare in general is not just limited to facial reconstructive surgery. It's also expanded to include, for example, smart face control and mapping and detecting facial movement in paralysis patients, as well as in helping identify new syndromes, such as very recently the DiGeorge syndrome, which happens to about 1 in 4,000. It happens as a result of a small segment of a chromosome, the chromosome 22, being deleted. It's led to severe facial defects. It also leads to congenital heart problems, and it has been hidden so far and has been discovered as a result of advances in facial recognition technology. 96.6% of the patients with this syndrome were identified accurately, as opposed to people who had been diagnosed using X-rays and MRIs. While I would not recommend the Mission Impossible sort of, facial transplanting and the impact that would have, the trauma victims and people with congenital defects stand to benefit enormously if we're able to make facial recognition technology intelligent. Over to you, Beth.
Ultimately, facial recognition technology is here, and it's impossible to put back in the box. With the potential to further racial discrimination and poison society with toxic standards and views, facial recognition technologies need to be understood for what they are. Nuclear-level threats to be handled with extraordinary care. But this doesn't mean that we should ignore them and attempt to put them back in that box. As we've explored tonight, facial recognition technology definitely offers great potential for good. Is it possible to have a regulatory approach that recognizes the distinctions between global threat and potential benefit and allows technology to develop and thrive whilst protecting against racial inequality and privacy invasion by intelligence services, governments, and corporations? We don't have all the answers, but we encourage you to stay informed. Coded Bias, the documentary dealing with Joe Guarini's research, is available on Netflix, and both the Algorithmic Justice League and Georgetown Law Center websites are full of incredible information. I will just take any questions.
Yeah.
Really good presentation. It was awesome. I have a question about like, what are your thoughts in terms of like data ownership, in terms of biometric information? Who do you think should have the power to actually own this information? Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because a lot of the, okay, so let me give you one example first. So Clearview AI, one of the companies we created at the start of the presentation, who has a very law enforcement based business model. They built their network with some, I think it was 3 million or some incredible number of photos just taken from public websites and social media. So the question, the main area of debate in this area is whether, and obviously like there's CCTV footage out there and stuff as well, and you illegally float around in public places and stuff like that. It's just whether you can, it's what you consent to be used with your data as opposed to obtaining the data itself. So in Australia, a lot of the stuff around this, the way it's been getting done is instead of introducing legislation at the federal level, they're just creating information sharing agreements between departments at the state level. So and like their argument they put forward is, oh, well, to build the infrastructure, again, when we already have it somewhere else, is inefficient, costs the taxpayer too much money. So you consent to have a driver's license photo taken for the purpose of but if that then gets fed into the say Australian Federal Police database for the use of facial recognition, that's a different story. So and also one of the points raised in Code Bias fairly early on actually is there's pretty extensive laws regarding the retention of say fingerprint and DNA data by police. And with this technology, your face stands to become almost equivalent. And unfortunately, one of the only cases relevant in the area in this country was in Victoria, where a lady had attended an environmental protest. She hadn't been charged or convicted of anything after attending that protest, but the police had images taken of her at that protest. And she took them to court. They should have to delete that because she wasn't charged with anything. And she lost that case. So it's we're sort of in a precarious point at the moment. And the answers, I guess it's a very tough question to answer in a black or white way, but we certainly have more attention because it can sort of swing one way or the other in a very bad way. Back. Sorry, can you speak up a minute?
Yeah. Clearview AI has actually shown that, well, pretty independent studies have shown that the AI is being more effective at identifying criminals than actual law enforcement. How do you think that kind of like human bias is actually more biased than the AI bias, and that impacts that actually being more effective at identifying demographics than human bias?
Yeah, I suppose it's more about, I think most people, I think it's more that it's largely warrantless at the moment that I think most people have an issue with. I think if there's, for most people anyway, if there's a solid evidence basis that this person was involved in something, and then they obtained a warrant to then identify them, assuming, of course, that it performed, that was the racial bias within the software itself was largely removed, then most people wouldn't have a problem with that. It's more the way they built their network, which I spoke on earlier, and the lack of oversight or legal framework around how technology is used at the moment. I think there's definitely some stories of some serious criminals committing serious crimes that they've had a hand in. I think it's more around some of the tangential factors and the potential for its use outside those places that
So, you know, in psychology, we sort of study about how memory is malleable. And Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, she's sort of at the forefront of this research where, you know, she's sort of discussed how eyewitness testimony is often unreliable. So, you know, compared to that, facial recognition technology and sort of computerized, computerized security identification systems work better because they're sort of markedly more objective, and of course with better training, we're going to be able to eliminate any kind of bias completely. So yeah.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that presentation. I learned a lot from it, actually. And I'm just curious to probe that metaphor of facial recognition technology as potentially like a nuclear technology a little bit more, just to find out, you know, what you concluded about that, whether you think it is just a metaphor or whether in fact facial recognition technology, in order to develop in a safe way, does have to be treated like a nuclear technology, which we use in science, we use in medicine, we use in very restricted contexts, like, you know, the Nichols Heights kind of within a regulatory and scientific context is highly restricted. So does that metaphor hold in a kind of more practical regulatory context? Or is it just a metaphor?
The reason he says plutonium specifically is that a lot of the medical and power-related applications of the technology can be done without plutonium. And its major applications have been for weapons. And you mentioned that I think it's used in tiny cuts and products used in space. So I think that's why he said plutonium as opposed to sort of relying on the technology. So
so that does come from Luke Stark, who is quite radical on one side of the debate. I think it's important to remember that we've explored all the potential applications for the technology, and it's more the regulatory side of it that needs to be explored. Who has access to these data sets and where can they get them from? So I think once we have a little bit more on that more regulatory side, then that will decide whether they can be used and will be monitored.
I think facial recognition technology is really the technology of the future. We, you know, when researching, we found that it stands to benefit even protecting security systems in blockchain and cryptocurrency, which is sort of the emerging economic system. So, I mean, it stands to have large scale impact for good, but in the foreseeable future, not immediately. So I think that's something that's important to note as well. Yeah.
Hey, mate.
Solve the problem about facial recognition working more on white people than dark?
That's an excellent question. So, because it's largely artificial intelligence that's used in the identification aspect of technology you're talking about, it's a little bit of a black box. So you're like, it's hard to see how it weights different features and what aspect, what components of the images it uses to identify a face. So when we're measuring its accuracy, we might do it in terms of the racial group that it's identifying, but the algorithm itself doesn't see any of that. It has its own thing going on inside that we don't fully understand. And Joy has some of her own theories in that area, and so does the Georgetown Law Center. So there's a sort of saying in statistics in general, which is garbage in, garbage out. So if you're training an algorithm based on a bunch of photos that are predominantly, say, white men in their 30s or 40s, then it's likely that it's going to be better at identifying white men in their 30s or 40s. And that's why she went to great pains to create a more broad data set. Another thing of interest is the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US. They've run a series of what's called facial recognition vendor tests. And so they take other people's algorithms, run them against a set of their own photos. I think most recently it was about 12 million photos from the FBI. And they measure how well it performs, not in terms of speed of the algorithm and accuracy, and then finding different groups as well. And they also broke it down by age. And they noted that actually with some of the algorithms they received from China or mostly China and some other Asian areas, that the discrepancy in identifying Asian faces was helpful small. So when it was being designed and built in Asia, for the most part, you would imagine with a training set that consisted of a substantial number of Asian faces within it, it was a lot more accurate. Also, it depends what you're searching it against as well. So let's say you're searching for, you give it a band of colors image, and what you're checking it against, the database you're checking it against, has a disproportionate amount of band of color within it. Because you're checking it against so many more band of color there, the chance that you get a false positive or make a mistake is a lot higher as well. So there's a lot of factors to look at there, and they don't entirely know why, unfortunately, so I can't give a straightforward answer. But there's lots of ways, particularly I think the most promising is in how it's trained to address the issue you spoke about.
So, shouldn't the way we solve that is by training it with all different images of people, white and dark, of all ages, so that it works better on everyone, not just
certainly
people in their 30s and 40s? Because that just seems unfair.
Yeah.
Teenagers don't get to do it. People older don't get to do it.
Yeah.
Even young people don't get to do it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
We should train it with everyone, not just somebody.
Yeah, that's certainly where we need to start as well. That's some regulation. Anyone else like that?
Yeah. They're actually working on neural networks, which will sort of automatically, and again, that eliminates a lot of the bias and the errors. So that's actually quite promising if it's totally governed by neural networks or probabilistic models. Actually, it just takes out the whole need to train with diverse faces as well, and that will make the analysis sort of more objective. So that's quite interesting. But yes, for now, there is the need to feed the system with as much diversity as possible, and to basically help it recognize different facial features, patterns, races.
Yep.
My concern with sort of facial recognition technology is that there's like a potential global equity issue. What I mean by that is we know that in a Western country, sure, we might develop facial recognition technology for all these good purposes that we talk about, and surely they will contribute to it. But we also know that even in Australia, where we follow like the rule of law, it's probably going to be used in some way. But how much more so in countries which are actively authoritarian and repressive? And like, I don't know if you've heard of China's social credit system, but like it's essentially Orwell's 1984 on steroids. And we know that they're actively spreading that tech to like African dictatorships And so my question is like, is there a potential global equity problem where by developing this technology that leads to people in these dictatorships and repressive countries essentially becoming like even more repressed?
Yeah.
While we sort of like don't suffer from the issues much since we follow the people.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I suppose there comes a sort of more personal issue about what it would be to potentially deny people who understand the benefits of that technology, those benefits as well. And like with public cryptography, I think with a lot of technological advancements, particularly digital, there's always another side of the coin. And if you also take a view similar to say like the foreign drugs, that it's in a way happening anyway, regardless of even like a total ban or like prohibition, stuff like that, that maybe just taking an active role in its regulation would lead to outcomes anyway. Because if that technology is going to be given, if those outcomes are going to happen anyway, if it's been developed overseas largely, then all we'd be doing is potentially denying ourselves the small or large benefits in the technology we do. Last one for that. If they're not trained on facial recognition specifies they're using data sets that people. Yeah. So part of it is a lot of it's proprietary as well. So there's a lot sort of behind the curtain as to how it works and how they train it, stuff like that. And the important thing to note as well is after Joy contacted before she published her work, some of the companies that she his algorithm she looked at, and obviously particularly IBM had the greatest discrepancy in response to the research. They actively attempted to fix it and were able to make, I forget the exact improvements they made, they were able to make significant improvements in the accuracy of their algorithm. So there's some hope there. Probably thank you everyone for listening. Appreciate it. Fabulous presentation, especially our work with unfortunately tonight as well.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And I just want to say a big congratulations to the two teams. They were really, really tough presentations, and I actually learned so much from both of them. Even though the Tech Social Group team, we wrote the briefs to give to the teams. I actually learned so much. Like for example, for the social media team, you raised a really, really good point about how their biggest strength of social media is the biggest weakness, the rapid localization. Just because we have such short mindsets and like attention spans nowadays. And for the facial recognition team, I was really impressed about how you were able to find a really good advantage in the healthcare sector. I never ever thought about its relation to facial recognition, facial reconstruction surgery, which is a really, really cool one. Just like niche, like things that you talked about. And I love the analogy of cryptography. I know that Aaron really loves cryptography. So I'm glad that you bring that in. So I hope that everyone enjoyed the presentations just as much as I did, and that you all walked out knowing a little bit more about the two topics. I just want to give a small introduction to Tech Social Group and all the stuff that we've been doing. So we were actually started this semester. This is our first semester of ever being on campus, I guess. And we've run a lot of events that I'm really proud of. And it's not just me and the co-founders, it's our entire director team who have helped us out so much. And I'd just like to talk about the events that we've done this semester. So in the beginning, in week 3, before we ran any events, we had our first launch in week 3. Oh. Sorry, it's not that works. Sorry, tech issues. I'm supposed to be good at this. I study engineering. Okay, great. So we had our launch in week 3. That was our first ever event. We didn't know if people would actually like our idea of tech social good. It was just the co-founders and I were just like, okay, let's go with it. Let's run with this idea and hope that people actually believe in us and believe that they want to participate in this discussion. And it was a really great success. We had both students and academics coming along, and it was really great to just mingle with academics and talk to them about issues happening. And we actually, a really strange trend is that academics love this idea. They love that students want to engage with stuff that's outside of the curriculum. And we hope that students also are engaging with this idea too. And from you guys and the unfamiliar faces I see today, who I hope really engage with this idea too, I think it is working and that we are starting a movement that is really, really good. So that was our first event of the semester in week 3. And then afterwards we were able to, sorry, I'm just really bad at this. We were able to run a few more events. So we had some talks with Good. It was basically a very, very casual catch up with me and with the Tech for Social Good directors and anyone interested in talking about these 2 ideas. So the first one was tech and social movements, very similar to the social media team's discussions. And then gene editing and design of babies. Yeah, so anybody was able to come to that. It was basically very casual coffee catch-ups where we could just discuss these ideas. And they've been extremely, really fun. Next, we had a Data for Social Good event. That was an online Zoom event where we got 3 really esteemed panelists. We had Suren Dayal, who was a CEO and angel investor. We had Luke Mills, who was from the Good Data Institute, and their work is to do with actually using data for social good, which is extremely relevant. And we had Sally Cripps, who was an academic relating to using data for social good. And we had a lot of participants come in and ask really, really great and interesting questions about how we can use data for social good. Just because the amount of data that's coming and piling up since like technology has been like more pervasive in our lives is just incredible, and we need to realize and understand how we can utilize this data to actually use it for good. And a week ago, we had the coded bias screen, which was, as Aaron mentioned, a move to do with facial recognition technology and how we can actually, and just addressing the algorithm bias within facial recognition technology. So, and lastly, we've been running the IRP for the past 8 weeks in the background, and we finally got to showcase it to you guys. And yeah, that's the final wrap up of all the events we've done this semester. And it's quite a mouthful, and I somehow was able to get through all of that. But I'm just really proud of Tech for Social Good and what we've been doing this semester, and I'm very keen for the events that are about to come. So yeah, you guys are all free to go now. And if you guys have any questions for us at the end, please stay back and talk to us. We're all happy to chat with you.
Wait, should I end it?
I think it's
We need to start the recording.
yeah.